Just letting you know that we're keeping this video share off until we get to the Q&A period at the end. The chat is functional. It is wonderful to have you with us. My name is Houman Farzin, and I'm the founder of Mystic Health, which is our practice now operational in Santa Monica with an amazing team and lots of exciting programs with new treatments and experiences rolling out on a regular basis. Thank you for being with us. This webinar is very special. The topic of near-death experiences is certainly one that excites many, interests many, perhaps scares some. All right, so without further ado, I would like to introduce my very special guest, friend, and colleague who's here with us from Toronto. Dr. Evan Cole-Lewis is a board-certified adult and pediatric neurologist, clinical neurophysiologist, and epileptologist with academic appointments at the Hospital for Sick Children and the University of Toronto. His clinical practice focuses on epilepsy, concussion, and persisting symptoms after concussion, brain injury, and functional neurological disorders, particularly functional seizures. He currently works at the Schroeder Ambulatory Center in North Toronto Neurology and is a founder of Homeward Therapy, a treatment program that delivers psychedelic and ketamine-assisted therapy in people's homes. In parallel with his clinical work, he conducts research in these areas and is committed to translating complex neuroscience into clear, patient-centered care. Before I pass the mic on to him to introduce himself, just for those that joined later, we have disabled video for this portion of the talk. You can actually go to our videos and pin them if you'd like to have it sort of enlarged. Otherwise, depending on your view, you'll be able to see who's speaking. And with that, I'll pass it to Dr. Evan Lewis.
Great. Thanks, Houman. I'm happy to be here. Yeah, really great to be here. I know that you and I started to talk about this some time ago, and it's great the days come. It's an exciting topic for me. So thanks for the introduction. You covered most of the things I do. There's a lot of other things in there as well, but really for the audience, welcome everybody as well on a Saturday to hear this. Just a little bit of background for myself to kind of engage in this topic a little bit. This was always something that has been of interest to me, but my deep clinical work really is with conditions such as brain injury and functional neurological disorder, as was described, and there always seemed to be an overlap here for me. But I've had a lot of experience in treating people from a neurological perspective with psychedelic therapies, and so I felt that this has enriched my view in this area, and just really excited to be here to talk about this with you today.
Awesome. Thank you, Evan. Yeah, I think it would be interesting for us to just speak about why we're interested in this particular topic. And I can begin. For me, I've had close encounters with death by loss, really from a very young age. I've shared my story here before, and I lost my mother at the age of 2.5. And I lost my second mother when I was in my 20s. So I lost two very close people to me, and that doesn't even include other degrees of relatives and loved ones. And so death is something that I've, essentially been forced to think about. I feel like many of us really don't have the chance to really face it until later in life. And, the other interesting part is that in my culture, so the Iranian culture, Persian culture, there is this sort of firm belief in an afterlife, in a sense. Death is not the end. And, so much so that, sort of communicating with the dead is something that all children believe in. Like it's very normal, to communicate with the dead, have spirits, and sort of, a spiritual realm beyond the ordinary experience of us as humans. So for me, I've always been interested in these non-ordinary states that have connections to other realms, and I've been sort of exposed to near-death experiences through stories. I've never had an experience clinically, I don't recall, but I've known about the stories of these strange encounters, people having NDEs and coming back with visions of light and unity and oneness and sort of the mystical experience that we also see with sort of other inductions. And so for me, you're the one who suggested we discuss this topic, and I'm like, yes, this is perfect. I do want to give you credit because as a neurologist, I find you're extremely open-minded. There's this sort of relatively conservative approach if we were to, I think, take the average neurologist, and sort of everything is limited to the nervous system, without much room for perhaps what exists beyond and what can't be explained simply. So yeah, I'm really happy to have this discussion with you, and I'd love to hear what got you into this.
Yeah, great. I didn't, but I didn't even know that, the backstory about this in approaching this, this topic with you, Houman. So that, thanks for sharing that. You've shared with your audience as well that that's such an interesting, it's going to add an interesting layer to our conversation today. Because, from my perspective, I probably couldn't come at this any more differently than yourself. For me, I was always someone who was just very curious about these things. And I think that was a product of my family and conversations we would have. But I would have to say I was, going through medical school and going into neurology ultimately, uh, quite a staunch materialist for a very long time, trying to explain everything through, a lens of materialism. And I think that as well, kind of a product of the environment that I grew up in. But at the same time, it was always question the limits, what's beyond that threshold of understanding, and then trying to make some degree of a materialist type of explanation. And I think I just wasn't exposed to some of the, perhaps what we could say in quotes, non-materialist or other philosophies or views. But I think that drive I had to think out of the box differentiated me a little bit once I got into neurology and then started to listen to people. And all of a sudden, I'm listening to these experiences people are having, and not just necessarily in the context of near death, but other types of experiences they're having with their own bodies, which didn't fit in any of the textbooks that I'd read on neurology. And the individuals, my mentors, the people within neurology, were always just discarding these stories to some degree. I'm making a broad generalization, but more or less this gets referred to psychiatry or gets referred to psychology. And so it's something that as soon as you hear this in neurology, you kind of just don't deal with it. But I just was fascinated with some of these examples that came up. I mean, I can recall just examples of, I trained as a pediatric neurologist, and I remember one case of a boy who came in who got body checked in hockey and couldn't control. He lost all sense of his body. He was paralyzed, right? There wasn't a single structural finding to explain his paralysis. And the thing that was so remarkable to me was this boy was just in bed, sitting up, kind of eating, so indifferent to his state, which was such an odd thing to me. I mean, I just imagine if you were paralyzed suddenly where how you would feel. You'd probably be anxiety stricken. So these states of consciousness I saw just didn't match with anything. Fast forward, I started to do some work in medical cannabis at one point and realized in that field that things weren't what they seemed or what I was told, and that kind of led to psychedelics. And as soon as I got into the area of psychedelics and started to see what these states, imbued and the lasting change from them, and then starting to listen to people's stories, I started to see how we could use this in neurology in some conditions, and that was it. And I just expanded. And from there, I think when you start to get into that field, and you can't help but stumble across near-death experiences or mystical experiences, which I started to, at one point wrap into my clinical work with patients and describing and talking about these with them. Um, and I think that's kind of, and then it was just kind of the piecing together of things. And this has only been the last couple years that has really given me a real deep perspective on this topic, which I think now with our technology, understanding of brain science can spread amongst neurologists and psychiatrists. We can bring these perspectives together and trying to understand these things ultimately for patients. I mean, that's why we're doing this, and that's why I do this. So that's my path to getting here and getting here with you today to talk about this.
Thank you so much. I think healthcare professionals are a bit siloed, especially, different specialties, just focusing, with a little bit of a narrow lens on a specific area and then tossing it to another specialist as soon as, there is some sort of doesn't fit the mold picture going on. So that's one of the things I appreciate with you and with other colleagues that are open to work together ultimately for the benefit of humanity rather than being focused on the definition of our specialty and the scope, which also has value, but shouldn't be a limiting factor. With that, I want to ask you, is there a definition of near-death experiences? How do we define a near-death experience? And maybe just broadly from a neurologic perspective, what's going on there?
Mhm. Yeah, and to preface this is the one thing I didn't preface in just with us talking about this. By no means whatsoever am I an expert in this field. So I think I mean, like, starting even there, in exploring this and exploring this purposefully to help myself understand more about consciousness in the brain and also for my patients, realizing that there is an entire field of study on near-death experiences that has been around for decades at this point in time. I think that's really important for everybody here to understand. So, this isn't, many of these stories have been popularized on TV, or you can read documentaries that seem kind of maybe out there and, in a branch of medicine that, you wouldn't find in your, standard kind of Western type of medicine, but that's not true. There's a dearth of studies and information on near-death experiences. So, what I understand of it comes from the literature, comes from listening to other people and other experts in the field. So, again, there might be even people in the audience today who have far more experience than me with this. But, for me, this is an experience and area of study that I can bring into what I know and map onto what I know and understand. And that's where the excitement comes from. But in terms of how I understand, in terms of definition, I don't think there is a formalized definition by any means. I haven't come across one. There are experts in the space who have stated definitions, and I guess, and these experts are looked upon as kind of the lead researchers. And, so for instance, one here, and I think it's important just to read out to the audience, this is Bruce Grayson, who is one of the leading experts, if not the leading expert in the world on near-death experiences, defines it as this. It is an event that is profound psychological event, including transcendental and mystical elements, typically occurring to individuals close to death or in situations of intense physical or emotional danger. So that's kind of the worded definition. And he produced a scale. It's called the NDEs scale. So people who have had these types of experiences can come back and they're asked questions. And I think there's 16 questions on the scale. And depending on the degree of that answer to that question, they got a score. And if you hit a certain score on that scale, that qualifies as a near-death experience. And this is how we kind of define them. And this is very typical in medicine. We have to kind of define these things, and these things that we can't see, these things that are reported experiential phenomena. You have to develop these scales of sorts of people who have claim to have these, and then you kind of group all this together, you come up with these scales. So it's a validated scale, and it's been around since 1983. So, and it was revalidated fairly recently in the last kind of decade or so. So that's what we know, and we can talk more about the definition because it's a quite a broad definition, and as you're hearing this.
Yeah, thanks. It's very interesting to try to somehow objectify this experience. And what stands out to me is that you know situations of extreme psychological danger, which is very interesting. Like so, it makes sense that physiologically, if we're being sort of threatened or the body may shut down, the nervous system is under extreme stress. We have that experience, but he brings in the psychological piece, which broadens the scope significantly. In a sense, you don't have to be in physiologic danger. What do you think about that piece?
So, with all due respect to the people in the space, and who am I to say this, I think it's problematic, to be honest, because I think it's capturing a really wide net, as you've said, right? If within the definition, if we're saying that these events occur with people who are quote close to death or in situations that actually are non-life threatening in terms of the physiological state, the physical state of your body. Um, you know, that right there, you're going to have different parameters. You're going to have different things happening to the body. And, for example, some of some things that get classified as a near-death experience, or at least are reported as one, is someone who is falling off a cliff. So this has been one of the reports of someone who's mountaineering, and they fall off a cliff. And as they're falling off the cliff, there's this whole experience of a sense of slowing of time and being able to distinguish all these very specific things that the person should do. But that's a common type of experience for people. You hear this, people who are in motor vehicle accidents, time stood still, everything was in slow motion, and there's Eagleman, he's a neuroscientist. He talks about a similar event of a police officer who's in kind of a complex situation in a shootout, and that police officer, everything moves in slow motion for that police officer, and that heightened, intense physical or emotional danger, yet the police officer was uninjured. Yet the climber who fell didn't actually physically shut down in the moment in which that person had their near-death experience, versus somebody who's in a cardiac ICU whose heart stops completely, brain activity stops as far as we know, and then has a type of experience. So I don't know, are we capturing different things here? I kind of worry a little bit that the definition is too broad.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I know that we'll get more into the weeds with this, but you brought up this notion of the brain almost shutting down. And I've had this discussion multiple times with my partner, Dr. Amir Vokshur, is a neurosurgeon who really sort of, sees our experience of reality and consciousness, all of it really as something that exists exclusively in the nervous system. And to me, experiences like these, when technically you're in this state where your nervous system isn't really functioning as it should, but there is still an experience of being and something that you can come back from and recount, with memory. Interestingly enough, like how do you see that? How do you
Mhm.
see the nervous system sort of, in relation to our experience of life, really?
Yeah. Um, I love this question. And I mean, obviously we could talk for an hour just on this alone, I think, right? So, I'll certainly do a disservice in trying to just create a short answer here. But I have this conversation often with my patients because, again, working in the field of functional neurological disorders, for all those out there, this is individuals who have neurological symptoms, neurological experiences, but we don't identify any structural cause for them. So another way to kind of say this, it's like a hardware problem is when you have a hardware problem in the nervous system, like a stroke or something that damages actual tissue, versus a software problem where you can have, again, paralysis, but you can't find a structural cause for it. So there's a software element to the nervous system. So coming back to your question, when I talk about this and try to, like, it's so hard, it's so difficult to try to explain this to people, and so we're always looking for metaphors. But I don't look at the abnormal right off. I say to people, well, why is it normal in the first place? Like, what makes you so certain your body is right where it is right now? Like, how do you know that? Why do we just accept that that's normal? Because all of us, to some degree, have this if you don't have abnormalities with it. So the function of the nervous system, very generally a high level, is in, together connected with your body. It's an active process. It's actively giving you this right now. So it's actively using its energy and all of its connections to put me in my place right where I am right now. And that takes a perfect orchestrated symphony of, like, you know, symphonies of symphonies all working perfectly together. So we just take for granted that that works. And we just say, like, that's normal and that's how it should be, right? All you have to do is just have the wind instruments off by a quarter of a note. And all of a sudden, my body's not here, it's slightly over here. And now my experience is going to change completely, but that's totally plausible and possible and happens. So it's kind of like I always just look to the normal and try to, like, and ask people, like, tell me why you're so certain about the normal. And if once you kind of realize that the normal is a active process and just an experience, then every other experience can be an experience beyond that experience. Like, why not? Right? And that's kind of how I look at it. So you can have dysfunction of the active current process of the nervous system, which can disrupt anything. It can move me from not only being right here, it can move me into the ceiling and make me look down on my body. Why not? What makes me so certain I'm looking out of my body right now and everything around it as well? And this digs into, like, some really cool stuff in neuroscience that we've discovered in the last decade or so that I can be fairly certain about. Not certain, but I can say this and kind of have a place of which I understand. I think I understand it and can help other people understand.
Nice, thank you. Yeah, it makes me reflect back on when I was 18. I was, really interested in different kinds of religions and spirituality. And I went to this conference it was like a Star Wars themed event that was hosted by a Hare Krishna sort of Hindu group. And they were sort of saying how Star Wars, in a sense, explains their outlook on life, and that, we're more like receivers
Hmm.
in a sense. Like, let's say there's a light bulb, and then, we're channeling the electricity from elsewhere. And so, to me, that makes sense that there is something beyond, our physical experience, and perhaps that's the seat of sort of consciousness and life, and, something that perhaps exists outside of our experience in this reality.
Yeah, so for me, when one says that or you say that, right? For me, I look at it as like I'm not so certain that there's, something, beyond. I think it's a tough word. I think, though, as our understanding of the brain is such that now when you look at theories of the brain, that we don't we don't experience the world by bringing things into us and then having the experience. That's not how the brain works. We have a good understanding that we've updated our model of the brain. The best models of the brain now tell us that everything happens internally outward. So we make these predictions of what our experience should be. So this is called the theory of predictive processing. So for the audience there, Carl Friston is one of the major scientists in this area, if you want to read more about it. But this has been a thought kind of philosophically going back to Immanuel Kant. Our experience is generated, and then everything that's coming in confirms that experience, especially as you have a sense of self and everything. So what that implies when you think about these things is that um, if there's a disruption in any of the predictive mechanisms, you can have alternative states. You can have different experiences. Because if I've learned to predict that the world is such as it is right now, and I said that's an active process making that prediction, then if that breaks down by any means, well, then um, walls will start to wobble. Because the only reason the walls are fixed in space is because my brain knows all about walls and all the things walls should do, and walls should be hard and they should be there. But all you do is disrupt this mechanism with a little bit of psilocybin, and all of a sudden the walls start wobbling and colors start having concepts and ideas. And we know what happens in the brain is the brain networks break down and the brain starts to become more integrated. And when that happens to the brain, our experience becomes more integrated. Things start to, as I said, right? Like you have these synesthetic experiences where colors has meaning, blue has a sound, or purple has an idea. And again, the reason they don't have that right now in our conscious awareness is because we are actively creating this. We're actively deciding our brains that this is what the world is like. So I get a bit stuck when to try to say like there is something, beyond. I mean, but at the same time, people have these experiences. So what do we make of them? And so I have I like to pull this back into kind of like what we know and what has been out there in the research and what we understand of the brain to try to understand these things, and that they happen from different mechanisms. Like I said, psychedelics, as we'll talk about a little bit more, or near-death experiences or other experiences. Um, these states are accessible from different means, um, which is also interesting, right? Like then how different or unique are these different states from each other, or are they the same thing?
Yeah, exactly. I think it's a great opportunity to delve into the psychedelic piece of this. I know we're both interested in that. And just by hearing even the scale and the definition, there seems to be a significant overlap between psychedelic experience as a non-ordinary state experience and the NDE. So I'd love to get your take on how you see these sort of experiences linked. How do they overlap? How do they differ, perhaps?
Yeah, again, you can look to the scales and see kind of like on the scales what comprises a near-death experience, and you can also look at some of the similar scales that have been done in the psychedelic literature. So we have the near-death experience scale on that side, but then you have the ego dissolution scale on um, on the psychedelic side, which was developed from the prior scales on mystical experiences, which were developed, that's where these ego dissolution psychedelic scales came from in the psychedelic trials. And then when you look at these things, they're some of the qualities, the shared qualities, things like once one is in these one experiences, there's a sense of timelessness. So time can either speed up to a point where it's timeless or slow down significantly. There's a spacelessness, right? There's this vast space. So space, limited space breaks down. There can be visions. There can be visions of light. There can be complex visions. There can be visions of God. There can be visions of beings. So we know this from a lot of the DMT work that's done, that you have the beings that are out there, or they're conceived of as alternate realms, or and then there's the other thing is the ineffable. There's just the inability to describe these types of things. So what we have to remember in all these descriptions of these experiences is that people are coming back and telling us this. Whether they're coming back from their psychedelic experience or they're coming back from their near-death experience, they're coming back and they're talking about it. So how do you talk about something that is ineffable if it was ineffable? Well, you just use your best metaphors. So right? So I mean, if you the spirit molecule, a great documentary by Rick Strassman, where they did the experiments with DMT. So this is an experiment where people had injections of DMT and went on these big DMT trips. Which, for those out there who might not know, DMT is a very powerful psychedelic, and if you're injecting it into your blood, you're going to have an immediate psychedelic experience and a profound one. And you can find this movie, I think, on Netflix or something that's out there. It's called The Spirit Molecule. People are reporting their DMT trips. And they report these vast arrays of kind of light and spectacular visions, and right. and all of these unbelievable experiences. But then they come back and have to tell us. So, they have to tell us that they were in this one gentleman talks about a cathedral. He was in a cathedral of light. Like, is it a cathedral, or is that the best, or like, is that what somebody who grew up in America of a certain religious, leaning would describe as something like that? Maybe somebody on the other side of the world would describe that as something different. So we have these kind of metaphors that come out of this, the best description. So where does it seem to differ, right? So what's actually interesting, and I'll just kind of, turn over to you after this. There have been studies that have looked at people who have had, or they looked at psychedelic experiences and NDEs and tried to find where they overlap. And they mostly overlap, like the descriptions of these things mostly overlap, except for a few things. In the NDE experience, it seems to be, if I recall correctly, life reviews. That seems to be something that happens more often in a near-death experience than it does in a psychedelic experience. And it was things about kind of like getting to an edge, I think, or a threshold. I think that seems to be a feature that's unique as well. And then encounters with deceased individuals. So that also seems to be something that happens much more of the time with NDE experiences than psychedelics. Otherwise, the overlap is like almost identical, which is a wild phenomenon if you really think about it. And then I have some thoughts about the unique features, but wondering like what you think about that.
Yeah, I think it's very, very interesting. I think back to my sort of conversations with our mutual friend and colleague Manish Gurn, who has an expertise in the neuroscience of the psychedelic state. And the argument with this cutting edge approach to the science is that there is an innate biological response to stress that the psychedelic experience is tapping into, so that because the question becomes really like, let's say from an evolutionary standpoint, why does a psychedelic state exist? Because in a
Mhm.
sense, nothing exists unless there's a reason for it to exist. And so the argument there was, when we're in a situation of heightened stress, we're tapping into this psychedelic state, which results in that plasticity. And, it's part of our survival mechanism that allows us to make significant change when we've had this disruption, in a sense, and let's say the predictive pattern of our survival. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it makes sense just even from that perspective. If an NDE is usually from a stressful experience physiologically, question mark psychologically, then the psychedelic state, if that is a response to stress, it makes total sense that they have so much overlap.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that kind of leads into this really neat thing you have to think about. So if we take like the NDs, and this is where we'll come back to that definition. Let's say we just exclude all of the non-life threatening ones. Like let's exclude the ones where people, did not their hearts didn't stop, or presumptively the brain activity didn't stop, right? So not just like an extreme danger. Let's like actually go to the pure physiological ones, right? And so when you look at that cohort, they have the experiences that overlap with psychedelics. So what does that tell us? At least if we look at it this way, right? Well, it tells you that at a point in which your heart stops and the physiology breaks down without any drugs or without any other situations, because this happens to people who are not in hospital. This happens to people who are out in the world and they haven't done anything except had a heart attack, as an example. And they have one of these. So that tells you, as to your point, and to the point that kind of Manesh has talked to us about too, is that the physiology is breaking down, and then you access this experience. And it happens in about 5% of people. So it happens in a lot. Like 1 in 20 people have an NDE in general, and I think that's American stats. So that's a lot of people, right? So okay, so you can access this experience, or this experience occurs purely from a physiological stress standpoint. Conversely, you can be at the height of your physical prowess and you can take a certain amount of a psychedelic substance, DMT, psilocybin, LSD. Ketamine actually has a lot of similarities to it. And you can access most of this state, right? With some differentiating, but you can get there too. So again, it's something from a neurological point of view, there is something happening with the brain, especially from the psychedelic neuroscience that we understand now, that's permitting access to this. Here's my thing I'm going to say about the differences. Okay, for all those out there as well who have worked in psychedelics, what's the one thing that we all understand about psychedelics? The important there's two there's like the set of rules, right? What is it? Set, setting, right? And dose. Okay? So set and setting are so important, right? Your mindset and the setting that you're in. It shapes your experience. What you go into it, right? And where you are completely shapes the experience. This has just been well known in the psychedelic space for years. So what I'm about to do is psychedelic experience, let's say from a medical, psychological, healing point of view, I'm going into that and my brain is fully going into that with all of that context. So when I come out of that and I talk to you or I'm your patient, right, and I say to you, this happened, it's a function of what I brought into it, absolutely, no matter what. And when we're practitioners in space, we know this, we hear this from people. We also set this up a little bit. Like that's the whole point of it, right? We want people to access their trauma potentially in some situations or access something or right. So we're doing this purposely. So you can it's so peppered by the experience going in. Okay, well, take the same frame to the NDE, right? So if you're someone who's a farmer out in the field or someone, and there's another account of a man, unfortunately, it sounds really scary. He was under a truck and a truck fell on him. Right? Felt like literally he was doing mechanical work and it fell on him. But in his description of this, he has a full memory up into the point that the truck kind of fell on him. So he knew what was happening to him when he entered his near-death experience. So for me, the difference being to have a life review or to be present with deceased individuals and have a threshold. I mean, that is kind of what you expected to do because of what had just happened to you. You more or less when that happened, it was like, okay, I'm dying. But you really like when you take a psychedelic, you don't actually think you're really dying. When that's happened, you actually are like, and if you've never had an experience like this before, and that happens to you in that moment, you are going to believe that you are dying. So the predictive brain has to make sense of this after the fact if you come back to report the experience. So I'm not saying people don't see their deceased relatives. By all means, they do. That's what they're telling us. I'm not denying any of this at all, nor does they go a whole review through their life. They fully are having that experience. Absolutely. And it's real and it's meaningful and it has change and it's important. It's vastly important. But but the point I'm trying to make is that there seems to be more of an overlap between the psychedelic state and NDEs than what in the literature is saying is actually differentiating of them. And I think that's where we have to kind of change our view on these things because then we can use the psychedelic state as a proxy to understand this stuff and maybe gives us some information of what it is actually like to die. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, one comment I'll make is, this concept of die before you die,
Hmm.
in my practice as a palliative care physician, having that death experience, whether it's just your ego or not, our experience is so ego driven that it can be really profound and it allows us to sort of experience that loss of self before actually facing death, which I think is one of the most useful effects of the psychedelic experience.
Hmm.
And it just makes me think of a patient that got legal access to MDMA for his PTSD, and we treated him. And it was one of the most profound sessions I've been a part of. And he had basically gotten into a car accident when he was young,
Hmm.
and his sister was sitting next to him in that car, and they got hit by a train due to his driving error, and his sister died in that accident.
Wow.
And this is a trauma, yeah, that he had been carrying for 50 years. And when he had the MDMA experience, he started communicating with his sister.
Mhm.
and his sister was there, and as real as it gets, and consoling him and telling him that it wasn't his fault and that he
Wow.
shouldn't carry this guilt. And yeah, I think it's what you take into the session, that setting, that intention, and what unfolds is very much related. So that's an interesting view that I hadn't thought of. Like the experience going into an NDE will determine how it unfolds. That's a very interesting outlook.
Yeah, I think it almost has to, right? Like otherwise we're not believing what these people who've had NDs are telling us because you're trying to make sense of it for them in a different way. And coming to your point of that, terrible trauma that you're describing here, but when that individual spoke with his sister in that experience, that is real. There's nothing not real about that, right? Given that. I'm sure as you because you probably used the anecdote, he did forgive himself afterwards, and he probably was able to overcome at least some of that trauma, right? Like that it created change in the quote real world, if you want to differentiate that whatever that experience was for him, that it created actual change, which then is going to change other people around him. How is that not real, right? It's just again, it's like again, come back to the normal. um, right? We just take that this conscious waking experience is quote normal and real because it's kind of the average of what we all share it together, right? But it is a creation of the brain. I mean, at the most materialistic level. And we know this. I love saying this to people. I mean, like just out there. And this is where the predictive brain mechanism can be so fascinating. Like, you're not even seeing what you think you're seeing right now. Your eyes are a lens. The world is actually upside down when it's coming into your brain. You're actually right now in this moment, everything is upside down as it's coming to your brain. And we know this from experiments with babies. When babies are first start, you can hold objects above for babies, and babies reach down to get the object because that early brain is actually truly visualizing the world upside down. But vision isn't the only thing that comes back to our brain. Your bodies are there and everything. So what happens, what the brain does eventually is it's like, oh, wait a minute. Even though this lens is flipping and I'm seeing everything upside down, the world isn't actually there because every time I go to grab that cookie, it's kind of it's not there and your body is down and all of a sudden the brain is like, oh, all these things out here are actually not this way, they're this way. And your brain flips the entire world for you. And that's what you're seeing right now. You just think you're seeing the world this way. You're actually not really taking it in that way. The brain has created it that way. So again, these experiences, and then you just presume that that's real. So this is where in these altered states, right? I don't even think it technically is a discussion about real and not real. I think it's the wrong words. I think the truth is we don't actually have the language within our understanding of consciousness and brain science to to describe what it is we're actually talking about here. Because real, non-real is just too binary, it's too dichotomous, and it doesn't take in all of the experiences that people report and that you yourself have. So I think it's to come back to this story, right? Like that is so real, and why not? And this is the beauty of I think what psychedelics has offered from a medical framework, and this is really what practitioners need to understand what it is doing for people, and that's why the integration is so important, right? Like yes, that experience is real, but we are here now, and so this is what helps the person restabilize after having that very real experience. That's what you're doing as a practitioner and helping people reorient and organize and be back in kind of this level of consciousness, but having had those unbelievably, corrective experiences.
Yeah. Um, I'm reflecting back to a conversation we had, and I think you mentioned that Bruce Grayson had sort of discussed an LSD experience and
Oh yeah.
called it an
Yeah.
NDE. Like, if you can
Hmm.
clarify that, I think that would be a really interesting
Yeah,
piece.
this was so fascinating to me. So he's written a great book. The book's called After, and it's so well written because he kind of really divides this up well, and then each chapter covers some, perspective or framework or philosophical underpinning of NDEs or the scientific, pieces behind it. But he intersperses all of it with anecdotes. I think, I mean, I think he's talked to thousands of people with this, right? So the anecdotes are so important. And this is coming back to my me pushing back on the definition being too broad. And I think we're doing NDEs and the rest of these experiences disservice by being too broad in this area. Um, one of the experiences he describes in the book is this. I'll just kind of paraphrase it. It's a guy who says that when he was in university, a buddy told him come over and do some LSD, and he trusted his buddy, and his buddy gave him 3 tabs of LSD. Okay, so this is a naive individual with 3 tabs of LSD. Let's presume they're real tabs, so at 100 micrograms a tab. So for everybody out there, that is well over like that is a massive dose for somebody who's first doing their first ever psychedelic experience. And if you were expecting this to like be like, smoking a joint, you're in for a massive surprise. So here we go. Here again is the idea is the entrance into these states, how it affects what happens thereafter, right? So he was not expecting this individual, and describes taking these 3 tabs, and then he starts to feel really paranoid because he's entering his LSD experience and not ready for this, not prepared. So he starts to, it sounds like panic and have major panic. So he starts to smoke hash. Well, like if you want to make this, a bad case worse, go do that, right? So he does that and starts all these. So he then describes hours of panic and horrible hallucinations, everything negative, and suddenly he dies. This is what he says. And he died, and he says, "I had my near-death experience," which is just the ego dissolution LSD experience. Like you listen to this, it's exactly what that is. And then he came back to himself, back into the negative hallucinations, the bad part of the LSD experience in the hospital. So which is really just him reassociating. I mean, coming back after having an ego dissolution experience that, was very well described in the psychedelic literature. So here you have an account that's being billed as an NDE, right? And yeah, that I mean, again, that person felt like they died, and right, but it's not an NDE as in where how we're objectively trying to frame this thing. This thing shouldn't get grouped into that. So that actually makes me question the research. Like you'd have to dig into the research and be like, well, what are we classifying as NDEs? And we've done all this good work on the research about NDEs, but what is being called an NDE, but is actually just a psychedelic experience. And so when I kind of start to look at this and look at this more from like my neurologist heavy like scientific lens, I worry a little bit about here. I worry that like there's been these fields that have been siloed, and in siloing, and developing, they're not talking to each other, and they're pulling in um, each other and calling it their own silo, right? And we haven't even touched on some of other things like in epilepsy, you can get some of these experiences. In functional neurological disorder, you have functional seizures, which is essentially one of these things as well, as I see it. And so, that to me, I think was really interesting to see or read, but also should kind of make us question a little bit, about what's going on, and bring these kind of groups together. Like they need to come together because we need to clear this up. I think that's my overarching kind of view.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting what you've discovered here is profound. And I think I never thought of near-death experiences as something that wouldn't involve physiologic stress,
Yeah, exactly.
physiologic threat to life. That's sort of how I viewed it.
Mm-hmm.
But in your research, you're sort of seeing that other non-ordinary states have been sort of clumped in. And
Yes.
I think it's a wonderful opportunity for some sort of collaborative effort to clarify this and study it. So that is really fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, ultimately, why, right? We could, say it's for the academic, distillation of these things and try to break them down and remove meaning. No, ultimately, it's for people, right? Like people have these experiences. So to the people, I understand that this can seem sacred and we don't want to, muddy the waters a little bit. It's right because they're very special. I agree. But if we want to be able to have practitioners educated and understanding these things to ultimately help more people who are having these. be it NDE experiences, being psychedelic overdoses or complications or areas where I see this through functional seizures, as I said, right? That are come at this in a totally different way. Um, we've got to kind of clear the space up so we can educate our practitioners better, ultimately to help people and be able to provide the care and support for individuals out there who are having these things either spontaneously, purposefully, or by accident.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can you just describe a bit the overlap with functional seizures and
sure,
other
sure.
disorders?
So again, this is I think I'm in a spot where I've been able to converge these things, where I'm seeing the convergence. So with my functional seizure patients, so for all those out there, these are people who have seizures that you would look at them and feel like they're having epileptic seizures. These are not epileptic seizures. They're non-electrical seizures, you could say. Epileptic seizures are electrical phenomena in the brain. These are non-electrical. So what this has to do with, it has to do with a temporary dysfunction of the brain. It's the breaking down of this active process. Very simply or very superficially, it says a disservice to how they emerge, but you could think of them that they emerge in response to trauma. Okay, to more or less, like again, very broad sweeping generalization. But what they are, they're an out of body experience. Right. So when the brain is in very significant state of stress, the brain will dissociate us from our body. And we hear about this all the time. You hear about this from assaults or bad motor vehicle accidents. People again have these NDEs where they're out of their body. So, your brain can do this. So functional seizures, it, as I have come to understand from all my patients, is they develop over time from chronic ongoing stress that the brain slightly dissociates itself. And then when bigger stress happens, it just kind of goes through a dissociative episode. So these episodes start to happen frequently. So you get these episodes that when they first start for people, they can be multiple times a day for weeks to years, okay, or weeks to months, and then they can come down and still persist for years. So they're having these constant episodes of dissociation. And when you ask them about their episodes, right, like a lot of the research with functional seizures is what happens to people. They shake, they turn, they roll their eyes, right? When you start to talk to these people, and I've now talked to hundreds, almost over 1,000 plus, you start to talk to these people, um, they will tell you they have out of body experiences that are identical to what is described in psychedelics and near death experiences. The difference is they have them all the time. And when you are, again, going into these things, you've had a life of chronic trauma and stress. These are not good, positive experiences for these people. They're a protective trauma response. So they're horrible when they happen to these people. It's context dependent, just like everything else, but it's a brain state that gets achieved. So I just had a patient the other day and I asked her, when these were really revving up for you when they started, did you have any experiences of being out of your body? I just kind of, oh yeah, all the time. Like she would never, otherwise never mention that to me all the time. And I asked, like, was it positive or negative? Oh, I hate them every single time. And I was like, well, tell me about it. Well, one of the first times I was in the hospital and I went in and I was like looking down and I saw the nurses and they were jabbing my arm with IVs and my body was shaking. And then I said to her, well, I asked her, how did it feel? Were you in your body, out of your body? And she's like, kind of both, but that's really weird, right? So, and like no one had ever asked her this stuff before, as an example, right? But it's the same experience, it's just context dependent. So it's the same brain state, just context dependent. So when she comes back to report it, right, that was her experience. Um, Anyway, that's the connection. And I think it's really important for the functional seizure space to understand this as well, because I've been thinking about these intersections for some time now. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to ask you, like, so some of the classic NDEs described, let's say someone's being operated on, they're fully anesthetized, and they have these experiences that sort of match the description of what actually took place in the OR. or if someone, again, was unconscious and something happened in the room next door and they were able to somehow know what happened. How do you explain that, like from a neurologic perspective, sort of having this, not just experience of timelessness and
Mhm.
transcendence of space, but also actually having some factual observations that don't make sense from at least our senses.
Okay. So this is great. I actually like this because these are the kind of um, experiences that I really want to ground, right? Because of course, if if it is that someone's having a near-death experience and they are, and we can, and they are on the other side of the world and they hear something, a conversation, and come back and report that, and we can somehow prove that there was absolutely zero plausible mechanism whatsoever that there could have been any connection there, right? Then now we're definitely moved into this kind of realm of the unknown. And I'm sure there's lots and lots of experience. So I honestly don't know enough of this, I think, but I have some ideas. And I have some ideas from, the literature. Okay. So again, I'll give you some anecdotes that I've kind of read coming across and I've read from, Dr. Grayson's accounts. So one of them is there's a woman and she was giving, this is in his book, she was giving birth and she started to bleed and she became unconscious. Right. And they were going to resuscitate her. And I think it was the one doctor wanted to say no more resuscitation, but the anesthesiologist said, we got to go. This is a young woman. Let's go. Let's go. And then they started to fight and they started to swear at each other. Right. And then they resuscitated her and she came back to life. And the anesthesiologist comes in and says, "How you doing?" And she says, "I'm doing fine. Thank you so much for everything you did for me." Because her experience was she was out of body looking down on this and she could see the whole thing unfold. And she recalls during that out of body experience, she says this, "I was so shocked that they were swearing at each other. That's what I remember. Doctors like don't shouldn't talk like this." It was like a thing that she recalled from her out of body experience. So a very specific thing that so she said that to the anesthesiologist. She said, "Thank you so much for being the one to save me." First off, like, how did you know? Second, but I couldn't believe how much you were swearing or something like this. And he was shocked, right? Again, he had heard a lot of these being an anesthesiologist, so he wasn't super shocked apparently in the anecdote, but how could she know this? Okay. Well, remember, she comes back to tell us about this. Okay. So that she came back to tell us about this, right? Um, tells us that going in, she had a sense, first off, where she was, what was going on, and you certainly knew, like maybe she knows she was bleeding, but your brain will make the prediction and has to fill in the gaps here. It will create something for you. She had a sense of the room. She had a sense of people around. And as her brain is failing, just because we can't pick up EEG activity doesn't mean you don't have sound coming in. Doesn't mean that that's not coming in. So she could very well have been hearing all of this. You might not have memory of it, but here she so everything there can be explained by the brain having some degree of sensory activity happening at the time. Having an experience of being above, well, once you come back to report that, and you remembered all of it, to some degree you remembered it, you have to report some interpretation of it. So the brain is so powerful. The brain will give you the sense that you are over top of yourself watching the whole thing. Now you could say, well, okay, okay, well, let's test this. They actually tried to, they've done tests like this. So this is a really great study. I haven't read all the details of it, but it more or less goes something like this. They set up little markers in the cardiac ICU, things that shouldn't be there, like a purple troll or what, I don't know, but there were symbols, and they put them over people's beds, right? And then they waited for people to have out-of-body experiences, which are quite common with NDEs. It happens about 80% of the time with NDEs, okay? Guess how many people were able to identify those objects in the cardiac ICU after they were definitely big objects that should have been there, right? But these are people that go into the ICU and they're kind of unconscious and then they have like a big event, their heart fails, they have an NDE, they come back to tell us about it. Guess how many people were able to identify the objects in the ICU?
Not many, I guess.
Zero. Zero, right? And they've never been able to replicate no study has been able to get somebody to describe specifics about a room, but you can have a general sense of it because we all kind of know what a hospital room is like. We all have a sense of what doctors should be. We have a sense of what nurses should be doing during a resuscitation. And the brain is very powerful. Again, the brain is a massive prediction machine, and we'll do this. Can I give a personal story here? Is that okay to just hammer home
Please.
this point? I get really excited about this specifically in terms of trying to like understand this phenomenon because number one, it helps for people with functional seizures. It normalizes the functional seizures, right? So it's not to discredit people who have these NDEs who feel very moved and changed by them. Not all, again, they're real to me. But it's also understanding this will be able to help people with functional seizures who are suffering all the time because these are just happening to them all the time. They're not pleasant, right? As we talked about. Okay. So that's the one thing that's what drives me to understand this. But then I had my own experience, which is I'm 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 like almost certain about how I feel about this at this point in time because this was my experience. So um, I had to have anesthesia at one point, right? And I've had anesthesia many, many times before. And weirdly and darkly, I kind of like getting anesthesia because I kind of sit there and I'm like waiting. I want to feel what it's like. And so it's like in this dark kind of way, I really want to know. So I try my hardest to like stay awake as much as possible and understand what's happening at the last minute. So and here's this part where I'm going to get anesthesia for a very short period of time, 5 minutes. Okay. And so I do the same thing. I'm like, okay, here we go. Even though it was like stressful, what was happening, I'm like, okay, I'm gonna right? So I'm sitting there, I'm waiting, and just to tell you that I'm someone who needs a little bit more anesthesia. So I said to the doctors right before they were about to give me the propofol injection, I said, last time they did this, they needed extra. That was and okay, no problem. He says to me, right? Then I'm waiting there, and then they're like, okay, we're gonna do it now. And my last memory is one of the panels on the top of the ceiling just shimmered, like it literally shimmered an inch. And then suddenly I was like, oh, where's everybody? So for me, zero time passed, zero. Like it's not like I've had surgery before. And when I've had surgery or been under anesthesia, there's always some, even though it's so fast, there's some sense that some time has passed. With this particular experience, there was zero time. It literally was like nothing had changed. All of a sudden, people weren't in the room. Immediately, without even thinking about it, there was no questioning or anything. I presume they went to get more propofol. I was just like, oh, they went to get more propofol. Like that, my brain just made that story up in the given moment. So much so that the anesthesiologist pops in. He's like, "How you doing?" I'm like, "Oh, I'm just waiting for you guys." He's like, "What do you mean?" And I'm like, he's like, "Oh, I mean, like, you guys haven't done it?" And he's like, "No." I'm like, "I thought you went to get more propofol." He's like, "No, it's done." I was floored. My personal experience of that was so unimaginable. Like, it's like nothing ever happened before. There's zero time. And I said to him, I was like, oh my God, that was crazy. I was like, no time had passed. And then he said, oh, I was like, that's weird. He's like, yeah, you were asleep for like a couple minutes, but then you started talking to me. You were talking about psychedelics. You were talking to me about the brain. And he said I had a full conversation with him about this, right? But I had zero experience of this thing. I was there doing all, but then, so it's almost like the reverse of one of these NDEs out of body experiences because in the moment, as soon as I came back to my consciousness, my brain made up a story that everybody went to just get propofol. And if he had never come back and I left the ER and I walked out of there, right? I would have said, I would have had to make sense of that. I would say, oh, my heart, God intervened or something, and my heart was better, and I walked out of there with no, I didn't need any more propofol. You make it up. This is what happens in dementia, unfortunately. This is why people become very delusional in dementia and paranoid, right? Because this is their experience over time. The brain will create these things. So coming back to this, it's almost like the reverse phenomenology of what happens with an NDE, I think, right? Like that you came back from near death, going into it to dying, that you came back you have to make sense of what was happening to you in the moment. You had some sensations, and those sensations were hearing the doctor yelling at each other, hearing the scrambling, people calling a code, whatever it might be, feeling your chest being pushed on, right? Your brain has to make sense of it thereafter that you survived it. Anyhow, this is diverge a little bit, but I get really excited about this because I think it does make me pretty certain about these things.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, the personal touch is always appreciated. I do want to address a few of the comments in the chat. So first off, thanks, Mandeep, for sharing the predictive processing resource, The Experience Machine by Andy Clark. And then Christine makes a really good point because as we talk about this, with my work as a palliative care physician, I'm thinking about, not NDEs, but sort of just death, and I view death as a psychedelic experience. And, as people approach death, it's clearly this non-ordinary state that overlaps significantly with psychedelics and with NDEs. From what I know, even before the brain shuts down, there is actually a surge in activity in certain areas like the hippocampus where you do have a bit of a life review, perhaps. And so there is that link to death, essentially. And that's the way I see a near death experience, is like a death type experience where you actually don't die. And Ashley is commenting that she appreciated your information on functional neurological disorders. It's really something I don't think is commonly known. I learned a lot from you over the years discussing this, including our talk at South by Southwest, which is a fun one. We'll have to sort of post some clips of. But yeah, I think, if anyone else has questions, feel free to raise your hand or drop it in the chat. And it's been really lovely having this discussion. So, Henry.
Hello. Hello. Thank you very much. I really appreciate this. I learned a ton. I appreciate the discussion of the analogies between the psychedelic state and the NDE. I'm wondering, NDEs often surprisingly lead to positive transformation in folks' lives. There was a book by um, David Rosen, a Jungian, years ago about including suicide attempts and often a very durable, transformation. You check with a person 2 years later, and their deep philosophy has been transformed. It humbles the psychedelic therapy context where remission that lasts for a few weeks and depression comes roaring back, even with things like ketamine that seem to really, in some ways, simulate these NDE type experiences. So I'm wondering if you have any suggestions about how what is known about these positive transformative NDEs and how that could inform preparation or integration practices for psychedelic healing.
Yeah, I can answer that first. So I don't know per se, and I would have to do a little bit more digging in the literature, but I don't know if it humbles the psychedelic experience. I think it actually reflects the psychedelic experience. I think it's there's a significant number of individuals reported and in the evidence base for psychedelic assisted therapy, in addition to ketamine assisted therapy, who have years later of prolonged change. In fact, the only ever psychological kind of experiment that's shown permanent changes in personality was through psilocybin trials, where there was a change in the degrees of openness and people's personality scores in the Big Five. So I think, first off, I would just say I think that would be interesting. I know there's been some um, degree to comparative literature on the psychedelic experience outcomes and also NDEs. If anything, I would say they're similar. I don't know any kind of systematic review or meta-analyses that kind of put these things head to head. Maybe someone out there can help me, but I think that would be an interesting thing to look at. So that being said, to answer this, I'm going to put my neurology hat on, and I would just defer to the neuroscience and neurology of this. Then I'm going to go to the psychedelic mechanisms, and this is the reason why I use psychedelics with my patients. As we understand from the psychedelic mechanisms, you have brain networks. Brain networks collapse, meaning that the brain becomes more wholly integrated in the context of the psychedelic experience. And then thereafter, the brain networks kind of come back online. They come back, they get reorganized. And this is the degree of integrative therapy. You help to reestablish the brain networks, which subserve our perception of the world and our thoughts and emotions and everything else. So this is the healing. This is the lasting change. You are altering the structure of the brain with psychedelics. You're just doing it at a functional level in terms of their networks. I argue the same thing is happening with NDEs. NDEs put people in this degree of stress. The brain networks collapse. This is the experience of the NDE, which is the same as psychedelics. And then they kind of reintegrate back So you can have people who, you know, significantly depressed, suicide attempt, have an NDE, and then are transformed permanently after that. Well, that is because the stress of that event, again, collapsed brain networks in which they reorganize, which is the exact same mechanism of psychedelics, famously coined the Rebus model by Carl Harris, which is all based on predictive processing, which is Carl Friston's work. So I think when you kind of dig down there, there is a neurobiological mechanism why these things work. And that's where it comes together for me. So it's more beyond the experience and what people are reporting. I have I can see it from a strong neurobiological model that underlies that.
Right on. Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's if anything, it just gives us so much more respect for the psychedelic experience. In a sense, you're having this profound experience that is sort of so comparable to death, which is the most universal of human non-ordinary state experiences. And so I think they can definitely learn from each other. And a lot of people take psychedelics lightly, but I think a lot of reverence should go into the work with psychedelics. And potentially a lot of harm can be prevented if we actually give psychedelics the respect that they deserve, because they can produce such profound changes that are hopefully, if done right for the right person with the right preparation and the right setting, the right integration, can be transformative in a beautiful way, but certainly sometimes are disruptive. And so I think it's an amazing area that needs to be studied further, and respect to all the work in both fields.
Agreed.
Thank you, Henry. If there's anything else,
So
happy to
there's
answer.
another.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Oh, and one last thing, Henry, just to answer, it's one other element we really understand in the psychedelic literature and understand psychedelic neuroscience is that you are correct about ketamine. Ketamine tends to have, perhaps not as long-lasting changes as something psilocybin, like something like ibogaine. That's kind of a little bit been described from a neuroscientific basis, is that we understand to some degree the acute experience of the psychedelic. So as much as that, so like ketamine lasts a couple hours. Psilocybin lasts, 6 to 8 hours, right? Whatever that acute experience is, it maps onto a longer period of brain metaplasticity. In other words, the ability for the brain to change. So if I take, I do a ketamine experience, I get about 2 to 3 days of my brain being in this metaplastic state, a way in which the brain networks can reorganize to a healthier composition as they were previously. If I take psilocybin, that maps onto roughly 2 weeks of this metaplastic state. If I take ibogaine, which lasts 72 hours, up to 72 hours in its acute state, it maps onto like 6 weeks, of brain metaplasticity. Hence the reason why that, the latter might be so good in heroin addiction, because the acute state gets you past the acute withdrawal, and then your brain's in this metaplastic state for 6 weeks to permit the subacute withdrawal. That's just, I think, an important point to the lasting effect of these things. So, what does an NDE do? How long is your brain in a metaplastic state following an NDE? I think that's so important, because if people are having these NDEs, like an example like we just gave, someone who commits suicide and then has an NDE, this is an opportunity to heal. There's an opportunity for them to discuss their trauma, reshape their life. Like, imagine we knew that. Imagine we could harness one of these in the hospital, right? You just ask people who came in with suicide attempts, did you have a near-death experience? Yes. Okay, here we go. They essentially had a spontaneous psychedelic experience. Let's use it, right? This is where this understanding is so important to bring these things together.
Thanks for that. And that makes me think of my friend John Konevsky, who has this framework around surgery. He's a surgeon, but talking about anesthesia, just any sort of experience like that can be used as a sort of healing modality in a sense. So
Yeah.
I think it's a great approach to have. I want to read a question by Marie. Are there known medication factors, specifically anticonvulsants such as lamotrigine or Keppra, or antipsychotic medications, that reduce the likelihood of NDEs or ego dissolution experiences in psychedelics? And if so, what would they say about the neurological impacts of these types of medications?
Yeah, so absolutely right off the bat. Again, this is a great question for the neuropsychopharmacologists out there, right? I mean, this is a fairly well understood in terms of the psychedelic literature, in terms of like which medications will inhibit the process, what do we have to come off. So right away, if we're talking about anticonvulsants, all the benzodiazepines will do this. So benzodiazepines, so things like clobazam, clonazepam, diazepam, all the PAMs. Okay, Ativan is one, which is midazolam. So Valium are the trade names for some of these. So those will absolutely reduce that. And I think one of Dr. Grayson's studies, they actually tried to do one of these prospective studies for people who were undergoing surgeries to find who had NDEs, and none of them had like an NDE, I think, or if I remember correctly, it's because at that point in time they started to introduce benzodiazepines into the anesthesia. So I think his presumption at that point was that the benzodiazepine actually prevented the out-of-body experiences or whatever they were looking for. So yes, that's really so probably to that point, Mary, I think if you and again, you'd have to look in the literature for this. But there's an example right there that I just stated where perhaps NDEs were inhibited because of a medication where and again we know this from the psychedelics, but I know this from personal experience with my patients, right? We have to get them off or lower their benzodiazepines. Cannabis will also do the same thing. You have to kind of really lower it. SSRIs will do the same thing as well. So these are medications. We're not worried about the interaction. It just prevents the psychedelic experience from happening.
That's very fascinating.
Mhm.
Thank you for that. Well, I think we're coming to an end and we went over time already.
Yeah.
Um,
So you talk for this for hours. Go ahead.
what's up? Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
We can talk for hours on this. Yeah.
But we already said we're going to do another webinar
Right.
even before we started this.
Yeah. Well, it is. I mean, appreciate everybody else being here as well. I presume, everybody here is interested too, but it really is fascinating. And I think at a time when I think the other thing too that's important to recognize, we're like, as I understand it from hearing Dr. Grayson talk, and there was a lot of difficulty getting that NDE research forward. Like, he talks about the challenges, and people themselves had the challenges of talking about these things lest they be told that they're crazy. And there's so many anecdotes like this. And I think this is so on the threshold right now, just because we're also in a point where our culture is accepting of psychedelics, like what just happened in the US, as an example, right? Um, so that we're now talking about them more openly, I think that's why the overlap is becoming apparent, which will change both spaces significantly, I think, if we focus on it.
Yeah, there's certainly more openness and awareness. And if someone didn't hear last weekend, the U.S. federal government, essentially passed an executive order to accelerate the integration of psychedelics from a medical standpoint, which is huge. There is some criticism on sort of the indigenous piece being stripped of, especially medications like ibogaine.
Mm.
But yeah, I think overall there's more openness and certainly a lot of credit to the pioneers like Dr. Grayson who paved the way to even, essentially step out of the ordinary and start exploring these in a rigorous way. So thank you everyone for joining, and we'll be having more of these webinars and definitely one more with Dr. Lewis. Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks,
Enjoy
Evan.
this weekend. Thanks, Evan. Be well. Take care.